Today, our friend Chris Bruno from Bethlehem College and Seminary shares an important life update and why Hawaii, even though it's a part of the U.S., is in dire need of local seminary training. All today on the show. But first, a message from ABWE President Paul Davis.
ABWE missionaries are coming beside the lost and the hurting around the world. And through the Global Gospel Fund, they're pulling people from the darkness and training them as leaders. They're planting churches, and they're even beginning their own missions movements. You may already support one ABWE missionary. Would you consider a gift to the Global Gospel Fund to support all 1,000 of our missionaries? Thank you for that.
Become a partner today at abwe.org/Global Gospel Fund. Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Advancement and Mobilization for ABWE International, joined by Scott Dunnford, who I can see right now, even though you can't, looking dashing as ever through Zoom. And Scott, it's good to talk to you today. We've had a lot going on at our headquarters here. We've had new missionary orientation. Scott, we just celebrated, I don't know if you saw, 30 new missionaries, 30 new appointees with ABWE.
So exciting.
And that's midterm and long term. There's all sorts of different pathways. You know, it's not always a one size fits all. And it's exciting to see all these different opportunities opening up for people to serve. And there's been a lot going on in the world, in ABWE, in each of our lives. One thing that we want to talk about and acknowledge before we dive further into this episode, many of you know Smitha Singh, who is a friend of the show. We've had her on twice, most recently just a few weeks ago, talking about the cyclone that came through Calcutta within the last few months here back in May. And we did receive word from our ministry partners and our friends with ABWE's Live Global division that Smitha's passed. She passed away just a day or so ago here from the time of recording. Due to some sort of sickness. It looked like there was something lung related. And we're at this point, we're not sure if it's COVID related or not. We don't know that decisively. Scott, you know a few more of the details, but first we just want to acknowledge that we are praying and we are inviting our audience to pray for the partners at JKPS, where she served in Calcutta, and pray for the friends of the ministry through Live Global. She, Scott, leaves massive shoes to fill in the ministry there. And for those of you that heard her on the show, just a gifted, high-capacity lady filled with the Spirit of God, being used in some awesome ways in gospel proclamation and in mercy ministry. Scott, do you want to speak to it at all?
Yeah, it's heart-wrenching. I mean, she's a young woman that we just talked to. And I just saw on Facebook a couple of days ago that she was celebrating her birthday and was sick. And then to hear news that it progressed and she died, when I think of her, I think of the Baptist Mother Teresa of Calcutta. And I don't think that that's overstating things. Her ministry in the gospel and assisting the churches and caring for the most needy in that community, it's going to leave a big hole. And just continue to pray for those partners. I know we were even talking about trying to interview one of the pastors in India today, and he was just too overcome with grief even to join us. And so we really need to pray for them and pray for the family, as they've gone through a lot. And, those girls and those boys are her family. And I know she's not suffering anymore, but we need to pray for the continued ministry there.
Yeah, absolutely. Please be in prayer. Join us in that. We'll share more updates as they become available, but we do want to shift gears slightly. I saw a great thread on Twitter this morning, Scott. I'm not sure if you saw it too, from our other friend of the show, David Choanis. And David was sharing about, hey, we're having all this conversation culturally about privilege. And he raised the important point of gospel privilege and the fact that those of us who know Jesus have the greatest privilege of all, which is the gospel, which in the reality, right, we know that those who are unreached, who don't have access to this message, are without hope. And if there's any privilege, we should certainly care about spreading and sharing in the blessings that we have. It's those gospel blessings. And so as we talk about needs in the world, and we talk about not just physical needs, but spiritual needs, theological famine is a major area of need, and especially in Asia and throughout Asia. And I know that that's something that burdens you, it burdens me, and it burdens our guest.
Yeah, and excited to have an old friend of the show and old friend of myself personally, Chris Bruno. You will recognize him and know him. He's the acting dean at Bethlehem College and Seminary, and has some big new transitions as he's going to be joining, not leaving Bethlehem College and Seminary, but joining with TLI and ministering in a place that I know is near and dear to his heart in Hawaii. I don't want to steal all of his thunder, but Chris, welcome back to the show. And can you just share a little bit about what God's doing? When I knew you back teaching together at Northland, the students affectionately called you Sea Breezy, and because of your love for Hawaii. Is it just the fact that you love the beach so much? Is that what's drawing you to Hawaii, or what is God doing that He keeps bringing you guys back to that place?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back on, Scott and Alex. It's good to talk again. And I'm in a car here driving in southeastern Michigan, so if you hear any road noise, for the listeners, forgive us. But we recently announced that we are in the process of raising funds and moving back to Hawaii, where we've lived previously. And there are certainly a lot of beautiful things there, beautiful beaches and mountains and all that kind of stuff. But that is not the main reason we're moving back. In God's kind providence, we have relationships and opportunities there to help meet what we think is a real significant need for theological training in Hawaii and from Hawaii to other places around the Pacific Islands and really the Pacific Rim. So we're headed back to do really what we did in the past, but to do it in a maybe we would say a more robust way, in partnership with TLI, Training Leaders International, who you guys know well, and probably many of your listeners know well, and in partnership with Bethlehem College and Seminary, where I'm on the faculty here and being sent out by Bethlehem Baptist Church and partnering with other organizations like the Gospel Coalition Hawaii chapter and the Center for Pastor Theologians. So we have this cluster of institutions that are sending us and supporting us and that we are partnering with the goal of training leaders, pastors, teachers, preachers in Hawaii and in the Pacific Islands for the life of the world, that is, for the spread of the gospel in the Hawaiian Islands, but also to island nations like Fiji and Tahiti and American Samoa and Micronesia, and going to places like Guam, and even reaching into Southeast Asia, Japan, other places. So what we're really trying to do is establish a beachhead for theological education. And God has put this burden on our hearts for almost a decade now, to establish a beachhead for theological training in the islands, so that we can equip men who don't have good access to in-person, face-to-face, relationally driven theological training, but not only there, but also to be able to send them to places where they're geographically, but probably more significantly, culturally better equipped for gospel ministry than some folks who have come from the mainland or who are from more westernized places.
Well, we will be praying for you because Fiji just sounds really awful. By the way, a question. Shouldn't you be saying Hawaii? Hawaii? Isn't that more of a correct pronunciation?
Yeah, if we're going to be technical, I should say Hawaii. But I did grow up in Michigan, so I don't want to pretend.
Well, there's only so much that can be done for your accent if you grew up in Michigan, then.
That's right.
That the Beatles, if they were from Hawaii, would say, you say aloha, I say aloha, because that's how you say hello and goodbye. Can you add like a laugh track or something to that, Alex? That'd be helpful.
We're going to need to, because I don't think anyone's actually laughing. So let's just shift gears here. So we're talking about Asia, Southeast Asia. We're talking about Oceania and the whole Asia Pacific and Pacific Rim. There's 42 million people just in Oceania. So what are some of the needs there that exist with the churches, spiritually, theologically?
Yeah, I mean, like any place in the world, just about, there are needs for more theological training. And when you talk about Oceania, that includes Australia, New Zealand, the Pacific Islands. So there are different needs in different places. As probably many know, Australia has a lot of great theological training options, particularly with the Australian Anglicans down there and some of the good work that they have done and are doing. Same in New Zealand as well is kind of, well, certainly more westernized than many of the Pacific Islands. But even in those places, there are needs for more training. But then our focus is on the Pacific Islands, places, small places like that I mentioned before. One example is American Samoa. Certainly not a large population, but we have friends who were born there, who have family connections there, who now live on Oahu, and they have a burden for the pastors there because there is no seminary there. There's no real option for theological training there. And that's true of many other Pacific Islands. So there's a profound need for in-person theological training for some of these pastors. So one of our goals is over the next 5-10 years to see a series of preaching workshops with TLI launched in these places where pastors who are already in ministry can gather together 2 or 3 times a year, sit around and study the word together. So it's very similar to what the Simeon Trust does, if you're familiar with them, but with a little more of a focused, cross-cultural, missiological emphasis.
Yeah, we're familiar, but for our audience members who might not know, explain what the similarity is there.
Yeah, thanks. So essentially what the curriculum does is walk through all of the genres of Scripture. So walks through all the different portions of Old Testament, law, historical narrative, prophecy, poetry, and same thing in the New Testament, Gospels, Acts, letters, Revelation, to give a focused time of study and teaching, but really workshopping together, getting into groups around the Word, coming up with exegetical and homiletical outlines so that the men, after a couple of days, feel like they're better equipped to handle that particular part of Scripture. So over the course of a couple of years, they walk through all of the genres of Scripture and get a handle on, okay, what are key hermeneutical principles here? How is this different from other places in the Bible? And how do these particular sections of the Scriptures help us see Christ more clearly? So just giving preachers some of those handles that maybe they've never had a chance to sit in a seminary classroom and probably never will have a chance to come to a place on the mainland or even in Australia or something like that. Give them a chance to be sharpened in their ability to handle the word well in their context for the sake of their particular churches. So that's one of the medium to long-term goals, is to provide opportunities for that throughout the Pacific Islands and then see how God will multiply that. And we're following, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just want to clarify something. And I think I understand this, having moved from Pennsylvania on one coast to California on the other coast, and realizing there are some significant cultural differences. Yesterday, my daughter went to go pick up a couch that she was buying to bring back to college. And I walked into this apartment complex with, probably 10,000 people living in there. I didn't see one Caucasian. In fact, I didn't see any other race but Indians in that whole apartment complex. And I realized, wow, this is such a different place culturally than where I grew up or where I just came from. Hawaii is America. And for those of us who haven't been there and spent time there, we may just be tempted to go like, it's America. Like, what are you talking about with the context? Like, what is different about Hawaii and the makeup of the people and the makeup of the culture that requires a little bit different approach to ministry?
Yeah, that's a helpful clarification, because Hawaii is the 50th state. It's a part of America. But it's almost a historical quirk that it's a part of America. And we don't need to go into all the history of how the United States annexed the islands and whether it was legal or illegal or whether it is what it is now. But it's in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's the most isolated chain of islands on the world. And in many ways, it's where East meets West. So the ethnic makeup of the islands is about 40% Asian, 30% Pacific Islander, and 30% white, Caucasian. So you have this interesting mix where I go there and I'm not the ethnic majority. One of the things that struck us most when we had lived there for a little while and then came back to the Midwest, the first time we had come back after living there for a year and a half or 2 years, and we're in Wisconsin and went in a Culver's. And I remember my wife, Katie, and I were sitting around looking and we said to each other, look at all these white people. And not in any kind of derogatory or whatever way. It was just, we hadn't been in a room full of exclusively white people for a long time. So even that, like you said, Scott, you go into a place and there are no Caucasian people around, or you're the minority, and it's different. And then culturally, you have this interesting mix of cultures in the islands. A profound Eastern influence with Asian cultures and all that comes with the family dynamics and, Japanese families or Chinese families or Korean families. Then you have Pacific Islander, which is different than, Asian culture, although there's overlap in different ways. Pacific Islander families, and they have a family structure that's a little different, and they have a strong emphasis on kind of extended families and some of those dynamics. But then you also have military culture there because the United States military has all 4 branches represented. Then you have kind of surfer culture, which is more of a California influence. And then you have a smattering of other transplants from all over the world. So it's certainly not a homogenous culture. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But all of that kind of mixes together into this mixed plate of culture that is quite different than what you experience in the Midwest or the East Coast or even the West Coast for that matter.
So if that's the landscape, what we want to do is figure out, what's your vision though? What's the goal? What is the goal that you're trying to accomplish here as far as the type of ministry goes, the gospel? What are you seeking to accomplish? We want to get back into that after this short break. We'll be right back with Chris Bruno.
Hi, I'm Scott Dunnford, and I would like to share with you about a new nonprofit ministry established to help churches, Christian schools, and other ministries protect children and prevent abuse. Rich Hamar from Church Law and Tax states that the number one reason that drives churches to court is child sexual abuse. I can't think of anything more devastating to these lives, their families, and our witness before a watching world than sexual abuse that takes place in ministry. The traumatic impact often leaves the vulnerable not wanting anything to do with God or His people. Furthermore, as ministry leaders, our efforts toward evangelism, discipleship, and spiritual formation are not only neutralized, but shattered. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention was formed last year to help ministry leaders understand the complexities of child protection and abuse prevention. They are establishing standards and an accreditation program that will help verify that appropriate measures are in place at your church or ministry. Learn more about them and their good work at abuseprevention.org. Find a helpful and free assessment tool to help you see how you measure up in this area. Go to abuseprevention.org and click on the link for this resource assessment. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention. Pray for them and follow along for this accreditation program coming soon.
Brooks Buser, president of Radius International.
I am here with Mark Dever, senior pastor at Capitol Hill Baptist and president of 9 Marks.
When you go to a culture that's a different language than yours, you're ending up in a kind of majority language that's been reached. And there are other peoples still more hidden, and it's those people who are often almost entirely unreached, and they take more cross-cultural effort. Is there a way we can better train people to have more realistic expectations of what life is like in the kind of 2 steps away from my culture? and be able to sustain family life with its normal difficulties there, so that there can be a long, years and even decades long witness in that culture. And it seems like Radius is set up to provide that training. Radius is about reaching unreached people groups.
Go to radiusinternational.org. Radiusinternational.org.
And we're back with Chris Bruno. Chris, before we broke, we're talking about the extreme cultural and ethnic diversity of the islands. But what is the goal? What do you want to see happen? Your end vision for what could take place throughout the islands? Obviously, there is a lack of theological training at a local level. There's a shortage of churches that are solid and sound and gospel centered, doing real evangelism. But what do you want to see happen? What's your dream? Because I don't think people do recognize that, even though it's a part of the U.S., Hawaii is, that we're really dealing with something that's, for many of us on the other side of the planet altogether in more ways than one.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a few different layers, and even stage it out. So that in the first layer, we would love to see a local option for in-person theological training there in the islands. I think I mentioned earlier, we've been coming at this in different ways for almost a decade now, and there's not a solid in-person option. Now, why is in-person so important? They could go online and take classes from Southern Seminary or Westminster Seminary or Midwestern and all these great schools on the mainland. And for some folks, that's the best option because they don't have other options. Or they can move to the mainland and be a seminary student or a Bible college student. And lots of folks do that as well. But to be able to stay there in their context, or many of them in their ministry, or just in their own cultural context, and be trained to be a faithful preacher, teacher, pastor of God's word, I think it is something that we should really strive for in any major metro area, in any major cultural area, so that they can learn how to apply the principles, the theology that they're learning well in their own culture or in their cultures that they're returning back to. And to do it in person, I think, is really significant. I'm of the mind that theological education is discipleship. And it's hard to do discipleship over a screen, even though we've all been trying to do it for several months now during this COVID era. And we're all understanding the challenges of that theological training or discipleship over a screen for the long haul just lacks something. There's so much of training that requires an in-person presence. So to give that option through Bethlehem College and Seminary, but also through the Training Leaders International series of preaching workshops, to have that available, not just on Oahu, but on other islands as well, Maui, the Big Island, Hawaii Island, Kauai. But then alongside of that, to be able to send out pastors from Hawaii. So that the goal is to take pastors who are serving faithfully there and send them out on regular trips to some of these other islands that we've already discussed, so that they can go. I'll go with them at times. Maybe others from TLI will go with them. Right. To do these preaching workshops, to again provide an in-person theological training island option to these other islands, to fill a gap where there is nothing happening now, to give them some in-person training in a way that will both strengthen them and strengthen them their relationships with other pastors in their community, and ultimately strengthen those churches. So that's kind of stage one. And then long-term from that, to provide a central hub of a pastor's training center in the islands, so that pastors on Oahu and other Hawaiian islands will be able to be trained, continue to study, and it could be a place where others come potentially for a season of ministry or a sabbatical season or just a season of being equipped. So the language I used earlier was a beachhead for theological training in the Pacific Islands, to really have a central hub where folks can come and then folks are going out for training is part of the long-term vision.
Well, let me ask this, because we kind of glossed over this at the beginning, but you're being sent out by Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis, which many of our listeners will know as John Piper's church. Obviously, you're associated with Bethlehem College and Seminary. And I would say, you guys can disagree with me if you think, but I would say there's probably no greater force for mobilizing missionaries over the last 10, 20 years than the preaching and writing of John Piper and probably the perspectives class. I mean, I would say those two things have really done more than anything else to get people to the field, or at least considering it and becoming missional in their lifestyles. What flavor does that take in your life and your ministry? You're thinking about, okay, there's a need here. There's some theological training and education that is lacking. Well, is part of the flavor of what you're trying to provide this sort of, robust heart and mind type of view of the Christian life that many of us are familiar with through Bethlehem and the related ministries? Are we talking about, worship and missions coming together? And the reason that missions exists is because worship doesn't. I mean, talk to me a little bit about, how do you want to see that kind of message? And maybe it's not just that, but is there a vision to see that kind of message land in a place that might be a little bit jaded?
Yeah, thanks for coming back to that, Alex. That's a good point to make, a good question to ask. It's certainly not an accident that we're being sent out from Bethlehem Baptist Church, which has a decades-long history of missions sending and mission supporting. Well, really, the history of the church itself goes back to the 19th century in sending missionaries, but particularly over the last 30, 40 years with the ministry of John Piper, where our stated goal and mission as a church and our stated goal and mission as a seminary is to spread a passion for the supremacy of God in all things, for the joy of all peoples through Jesus Christ. And those aren't just platitudes. One of the reasons why the board of trustees of Bethlehem College and Seminary was enthusiastic to start this extension site of the seminary on Oahu is because of this vision for spreading. So John Piper and Jason Meyer and others who are maybe a little well-known were very encouraging and enthusiastic about this vision, because we see this as the way that the seminary and the mission of proclaiming the supremacy of God for the joy of all peoples, so that this Christian hedonism is the language Piper uses to increase this mission, is not going to be done through growing a mega seminary in Minneapolis, but rather our strategy is to send out faculty to extension sites. So I'm not alone in starting a Bethlehem extension. We actually have one up and running in Cameroon that others in the seminary are involved with. And we have some others. We have one down in Memphis that has a strategic reach into the community there, and others are in the works. But so the goal of this is to continue to this great mission that many of us have been gripped by decades ago, that we would spread a passion for God's glory, particularly through theological education, seeing the centrality of Christ in the scriptures, and continuing to multiply that DNA. So when I say I'd like to see a solid theological training option in the islands, along with that comes a school where this big vision of God is put on full display. We believe in God's sovereignty. We believe in God's exhaustive authority over all things. But we believe that through God's sovereignty, he gives us the greatest joy. And by recognizing his glory and delighting in his glory, we find our greatest joy and satisfaction. That's what we were created for. So to continue that mission, to spread it into the islands, not just the Hawaiian Islands, but the Pacific Islands and the Pacific Rim, it is really the mission that we're on. And we want to see that multiplied through the school, through preaching workshops, through pastoral equipping, through church planting, through church revitalization. So seeing that our efforts is really a gospel hub that then has all these spokes that are starting to spread out, both literally in the sense of geographically, but then also in terms of different ministries, church planting, church revitalization, theological training, all driven by this united mission to spread a passion for God's glory, seen in the face of Jesus Christ as we come to know him more faithfully from all the scriptures.
One of the things that you and I have talked about before, Chris, and we've even experienced together, is that a lot of times where there is a theological training place, a pastoral training center, it seems like there's a lot of churches around those places. That isn't coincidental. But the reverse is also true, that when you've got people leaving where they've grown up and going away, far away often, to school, that they don't come back, and they just kind of get sucked into the ministries that are around the college or seminary, and they stay there. And I think that kind of highlights a little bit of why it's so important that we have local church-based theological training in the locations where those people will be ministering, so that they don't get sucked into, the Louisville, Kentuckys and the Dallas parts of the country and places with lots of theological education, but they actually come back to the places where they, where their roots are and where their culture is and how important it is. So I'm excited about that. But I also know that you're excited, and I think that you might have even written a book about this, of churches partnering together. How do you see this kind of vision for theological education around the Pacific Rim and Oceania and based out of Hawaii? How do you envision churches partnering together to see that happen?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think you're exactly right in terms of having theological training options where people are from, particularly in hard places to live. So people say, oh, Hawaii, that's such an easy place to live. Well, maybe. If you have a lot of money, maybe it's an easy place to live. Or if you have, a lot of support structures around you, or you have a free housing situation, maybe it's a little easier. But oftentimes when guys move to the mainland for seminary, that house that'll cost them $950,000 in Hawaii is only $200,000 in Louisville. That's appealing. So to have options there, or they'll marry somebody from Oklahoma and stay on the mainland, which is fine. And, God is sovereign over all of that. So I don't begrudge anybody where they end up or where they stay or go. But to have that option is significant. And then I think the second part of your question, or your real question in terms of churches partnering together, one of our goals is that we'll see, and we've had this goal since we moved to Minneapolis. One of the things I said we wanted to see was Bethel Baptist Church partnering with local churches in the Hawaiian Islands for the sake of raising up pastors and church planters. So we've got 2 seminary students from the islands who are up in Minnesota in seminary, and God willing, we'll be able to send those folks back in the next few years. And we've had a lot of interaction between churches in the islands and Bethel Baptist Church. So this is taking it kind of to the next level. So I'd like to see not just churches in Hawaii partnering together in this project, which I could talk about and we could think about, but also churches on the mainland partnering together to support this project. Yeah, yes, through financial support and kind of the traditional missions giving type of thing. We pray that there be many churches involved with that, but also to be able to send pastors, seasoned pastors. I was talking to an elder at a church in the Twin Cities area a few weeks ago, and their pastor is, getting into his 60s, and he's been at the church for 30 years, and he has a lot of experience and a lot of wisdom. So to be able to send him to spend a week with some of the younger pastors in Hawaii that we're training, just share their wisdom and what they've learned, what he's learned over the course of decades of ministry. And then for him to learn from them what ministry will look like. So to have some of those kind of trans-Pacific partnerships for the sake of this mission. But then on the ground in Oahu, we've seen this in the past, and I think we're seeing it again right now. A lot of churches there in the islands are small, either single staff or maybe one full-time pastor or one part-time person. They don't have a lot of resources. They don't have a lot of bandwidth to be able to pull off long-term church planting programs or long-term mission strategy. So to provide a hub for theological training will also provide a hub for church partnerships, so that as guys go through degree programs and classes together, they can dream together about how God might use this PCA church and this SBC church to partner together for different, maybe theological training options on other islands, or ways to reach the community, or ways to think about supporting each other's church planters. So there's lots of fruit that results from getting pastors together for these kind of theological training options. Mm-hmm. And that's not just true in Hawaii, that's true anywhere around the world, but there's a particular need for it there because of the fact that many pastors are just spread very thin, they're very weary, they need encouragement, they need support, they need men to rally alongside of them. So I'm a little too young to be a pastor to pastors, but I can be an encourager of pastors and an equiper of pastors and a friend to pastors, and then I can bring them together to accomplish things that maybe their church by themselves wouldn't have the energy or the resources to be able to do.
And Chris, it's good for us to challenge everybody here, to borrow from your pastor's, one of his often used phrases, don't waste your theology in this case. Don't waste your theological education. Don't waste your pastoral experience. And I think you're setting an incredible example as a guy who's been leading in a theological, biblical, academic setting, and certainly engaged in the local church, who's taking that and saying, it's not your traditional missionary kind of role. I mean, we talk about missions all the time here, but it is very much you're drawing on the depth of resources that God has entrusted to you and saying, hey, how can I use this abroad? And what we need is to challenge seminary professors. We need to challenge Sunday school teachers. We need to challenge pastors, whether it's long-term or short-term, back and forth. Don't waste the theological knowledge that God has given you. Don't waste the biblical knowledge that God has given you. Because not only are there unreached peoples, but there's people that are reached, but that need to be built up in those ways. And we want to spread that message far and wide. Chris, how can people hear more from you?
Well, we just launched our new website, which is just chrisbruno.net. Easy to remember that way. And what we're doing there is just laying out some of our ministry goals and objectives and how folks can partner with us. So that would be the best place to start. And there's a way to get in touch with me through that website.
Awesome. Chris, thanks for joining us today. And we invite our audience to be praying for you in your new ministry. And thanks for joining us from the car today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and putting up with the road noise. Hopefully the sound will be okay, but I enjoyed the conversation, as I always do with you guys.
And thanks for driving, Katie. She is there. I know she's there. She's just being
Katie Bruno, everybody. All right. Thank you so much. To get more content, go to missionspodcast.com or check out abwe.org/podcast. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share. To ask a question or suggest a topic, email alex@missionspodcast.com, and we'll see you next time on the Missions Podcast.